Hi there, welcome to Unit 4 for this afternoon of Tuesday. I know the tempo is increasing a little bit, but don't forget we're going to have a bit of a lull where, yes, you're going to have presentations to make, but then you'll have lots of time when you're not actively engaged tomorrow afternoon. Suddenly no forums, no posting, so that's going to slow down the tempo a little bit for our next 2 days. So for this afternoon, oh, and I'm online on my screen, so you see my two dogs, which I no longer have. I lost them both in the last, but I had them for 12 years, so they're still on my screen. Okay, here we go. Language in educational research, flavor, register, level of language in various academic writing. This is important because you're starting this course, you're starting your journey on the master's, and you're grappling again with what academic writing looks like. And as I've started to tell you, there's been a sort of revolution around publication and around the gatekeeping that used to be there and no longer is there. So this revolutionization has led to a democratization of access to writing. So less gatekeeping, less signposting, great for most people because there's so much more freedom, but also more complicated for you as a graduate student because you've got to navigate yourself where the signposts have been removed. So it's created this extra tension of being able to develop this skill and this sixth sense for what is a reliable source, what is decent academic writing, and what isn't. And in essence, the objective for today is that you're going to have to find your way through that because it's no longer signposted. You're going to have to develop your own sense as to what is a reliable sense, a source with no indication from the field itself. You're going to have to develop that. So it's quite tricky, and it's worth spending an afternoon just looking at that and doing a few interactive sort of exercise around that. So you've got the objectives for today. Again, look at the media sources. Again, if you're fighting with time, it's fine to skip them. You can go back to them tomorrow. You can go back to them on Thursday. I would still encourage you to interact because it's very formative. Don't forget that this is your assignment too. So the more we engage on it, the more I have time to go back and give you a few pointers. The easier it is going to be to take that sort of critical research lens on these posts in your assignment too. Okay, so don't don't give up altogether. I would still go through the process. It's going to be really great to make sure that you complete your assignment too, but you can do it in whatever order you want. You can just come back tomorrow afternoon or tomorrow or Thursday afternoon. So that's that. Nature and format. So what is reliable source? I've sort of explained that. In the old days, you used to go to journals and you used to only go to official journals, highly ranked journals. There's a ranking system, as you probably know, in journals. We know their sort of visibility impact. We know their impact rate. We know their visibility. There's also of indexes that used to tell us which ones are the good ones, which ones are not. A good criteria was also tended to be the double blind. So if they were double blind international journals, they were the best. If they were double blind national journals, it was slightly under that. If they were not double blind national or provincial journals, they were a little bit under that. But that structure was so historical, rigid, easy to navigate, but obviously, as you can imagine, really constrictive as well for the field because it's a process that eliminates a lot of people that are voiceless. There's a lot of work being done around the fact that scholars of different cultures, of different race, of different ethnicity used to find it very difficult to go through this sort of very rigid process that is really designed for the insider but not designed for the outsider. So insiders were finding their way easily, outsiders were not, and it's been revolutionized, and that's great. And now you're going to find academic writing in a ton of places, and that's really great. But not so great for you as graduate students because you've got to again develop this sixth sense as to what is what. So you have a chat, and this one would be an important one for this afternoon. Try and interact as all class. How would you recognize from tone what academic writing looks like? I think it's a really important exercise to do, to give it a thought, to put a few posts up, and to try and do a collective reflection around this, because you will be able to extract a lot of that, and I will guide you through the rest of the unit. So at this point, I would suggest pause the recording and go off to that forum in the virtual forum 4 and get onto that discussion thread and post a few ideas about what is your trick. What are you currently doing to seize whether something is reliable or not, whether it's actually formal academic writing, whether it's not. In the end, whether you could cite it in one of your papers or not. Really, that's the bottom question of what I'm asking. And there is now no outside sign, so you've got to do it purely on tone. So if you've paused and now starting again, the nature and the format of what is reliable has really changed. So first of all, you've got a lot of research generally and education research more precisely that has moved away from a positivist approach. Again, you're going to look at positivism when you get to your theory course, but positivism is the traditional historical lens that has been applied to science. It's only one of many theories. I would argue it's only one of four major theories now that articulate scientific research. So it's far from being the norm, but historically it has been what we've seen, and certainly what's sort of perpetuated media as being the norm in terms of science. And positivism used to be, again, that theoretical approach that there's only one universal reality. We're getting closer and closer to it through a process of rigor, through this process of hypothesis that is proven or disproved, and that a quantitative sort of journey takes us closer and closer and closer, not ever there, but closer and closer and closer to the world that it really is. Sort of reductionist, as we've already seen, doesn't really apply to social phenomena and social interaction, but in the world of natural science, it worked well. So a lot um, of of this notion of journal sort of publication and journal editing was really focused on that, because really traditionally you would only really source things that were positivist in approach to science, but that has changed. And more, again, social sciences explosion after the Second World War, and now we're looking at really you know phenomena that are socially based. And therefore, we're looking, again, as I keep mentioning, this notion of looking at people's perceptions of things, people's subjective reality, the construct of reality which they build through their lived experience. And so, obviously, when we are creating qualitative phenomenological studies, we are going to be wanting to actually see those lived experience. And so, when these publications, these phenomenological qualitative publications, are looking at data, they're not just looking at data which is numbers and this sort of data. They're looking at the lived experience of people. So they themselves, in their methodology, are going to want to incorporate as data things that are very subjective. And so more and more, we're going to have people who are going to have wanting to include video and photos and discourse and storytelling. So you see the methodologies themselves are changing, and therefore, as people do academic writing, more and more they tend to want to include these forms of sources into their writing themselves. So a study might be looking at storytelling, and then other studies that discuss this movement or that field, that area, might in turn want to also look at how lived experience of professionals, for example, are being discussed in the field. So they might start looking at the newsletters, they might start looking at chat rooms of teachers, they might start looking at videos that teachers are producing, they might be looking at the content of communications from schools. Okay, all that lived experience, that phenomenological data which is starting to be interested to us, becomes uh, raw data for the studies themselves. And obviously we are recognizing through that process a lot of production of message that we weren't recognizing before. Before, if you wrote something in a teacher's newsletter, there was no way that was going to enter academic writing. These days, it does. It does because it enters first as data in phenomenological studies, and then it creates this interest around the lived experience of the field. And so, therefore, we've sort of exploded outwards and said, okay, all of these things are relevant. They actually are part of our data, and therefore, we should actually look at all this as being writing of its own, writing that is recognizable and can be sourced. So as you can imagine, it's a huge sort of explosion in with regards to what we actually are willing to accept as being a reliable source. So, conclusion that now the notion of reliable source becomes spectrum rather than a clear concept with neat delineation. So, obviously, it includes journals about articles in education, but also journal articles in other fields, sociology, anthropology, ethnography, media studies, communication studies. They work very differently. They have their own methodologies, but now we're exporting some of that writing into our field and saying these are sources that I'm seeing as reliable. New fe- new features, news features, sorry. So print, web-based, that could be national, provincial, regional, school boards, school newsletters, and then wider than that, academic videos, blogs, vlogs, podcast, website. All of these things would be acceptable as well because they have inherent value of themselves because they represent the lived experience of members of our field, and therefore at some point they are entering into our discussions and they become study worthy, research worthy. Okay, so you see now that we have a huge spectrum. So in order to start looking at the different, really be very tangible about looking at what we now would include as a reliable source, I've given you some examples, and each time you have, shouldn't take you too long, but read the example and tell me, answer the questions and tell me what are the specific features of that writing. It's not necessarily always journal articles. So we're going to start with a typical sort of educational journal article. So you're going to identify the features, but then we're going to move on to the other types. And then you're going to identify the features of that so that you can recognize them and you can still put them in the reliable source sort of envelope or toolbox that you're creating for yourself. So that when you're developing that sixth sense, you're able to recognize that, say, okay, that comes from this type of writing, and that is still okay. That's still an acceptable source. I could still, reference that in a paper that I'm doing for a course or for later on or for a job. So you've got the journal articles here. This is pretty traditional, comes from an educational journal article. What are the main features of this kind of writing? It shouldn't take you too long. Pretty sort of jumps at you. So just post a few remarks on that, and collectively we'll get a good sense of what you're identifying as your signposts here. Now you have journals from other fields. So I've taken something from a very different field, read the paragraph, and my question to you is, how does this set itself apart from the tone you normally expect in an educational research paper? So that's going to enable you to identify a few features, mention them on the chat, on the thread that I've created for that, and then collectively we'll be able to identify some of the key characteristics that you would recognize as being journal articles from another field, very different writing, very different maybe conventions, but still acceptable as a reliable source. Okay, it's going to enable you again to create that sort of sixth sense as to what you accept and what you are putting in your little bag of acceptable resource. Now, once you've done that, we're jumping to a new sort of sample. Here we have news features: print-based, web-based, national, provincial, regional, school, and school board. So I've given you something from the Guardian Education, something that I've cited many times. I cite the Guardians and other sort of education supplements in various national publications. And the question I have for you here after you've read it is, in which ways does this sort of academic writing set itself aside from what you identify as a traditional etiquette of journal articles? Is the content any different? So what's the difference between this and what we've seen so far in terms of journal articles? What sets it aside? How would you recognize it? And then acknowledge the fact that this is still a reliable source. All right. So how would you recognize this as being a reliable source if you saw it elsewhere and you had to screen and use that filter to decide whether you would reference this or you wouldn't? And then we go on to the last item. Academic videos, academic blog, vlogs, podcasts, and academic websites. So here I've given you an extract from a colleague who works in UDL, and I've given you an extract of her blog, professional blog. What are the major differences would there be here between a blog and a journal publication? So it enables you to see the very specific characteristics of this sort of writing. It should jump at you. And then that's going to enable you to, again, widen your spectrum a little bit and say, okay, now I recognize the characteristics of this sort of writing. It has specificities. I'm able to identify them, and I would be able to apply that filter in the field and say, okay, I accept this as a reliable source for this and that reason, and I'm going to be able to cite this. So by the end of finishing this exercise, you should now have created a toolbox by which enables you, hopefully with reflection, to identify distinctive features of writing, which is no longer just identified by that narrow sort of set of conventions that we had in educational journal writing, but now you have subsets, and these subsets are different and yet very recognizable, and you're able to then draw from these four different sort of sources to use as resources or references in papers. Okay. Now you're going to put this in practice, because it's all very well doing it sort of proactively in the sense when you're given the type and you have to recognize it. So it's the fun part. You've got 4 vignettes, and well, we're finding a way. We'll examine several extracts together and determine what the tone implies, what reliance. So I can't speak. It's 8:30 in the morning. I haven't slept enough. What reliance we might be able to give. What reliance we might be able to have on these sources, and whether these voices are those of educational researchers. So in the end, I'm saying really, where does this come from? So again, is it an educational journal? Is it a journal from another field? Is it press based or print? Is it a blog, an academic website? Okay, it's obviously definitely a reliable source. You would definitely be able to cite this, but which of these four mediums did it come from? To try and see how you're developing that sort of sense to be able to pick up. So you've got Vignette 1, you've got Vignette 2, you've got Vignette 3, and you've got Vignette 4. So I've created a thread, and then what I'd like to do in the thread is tell me which does it come from? What's the nature of this writing? Academic, journal article, website, blog, educational press. And actually, if you want to be more specific, I'm saying, is it an educational journal? Is it a journal article from another discipline? Is it press? Or is it the sort of website, personal website, academic website, blog? Okay? And tell me that in the thread, and then at 4:30 we'll go through it together, and I will reveal where these came from. Don't cheat, okay? Don't try and find it. It's just not worth the investment in time. I'll just give you the answers, but try and practice and see what your sixth sense tells you. As you see, this unit is not huge. It is important that you start reflecting on this. I'm going to finish off with a last thread, and this could be an open thread that we carry through the week because it's going to be helpful for the rest of your program. Since we're looking at language, and we're looking at formats, levels of language, tone, what makes writing professional or not professional. One thing that you're hitting as you, for some of you coming back to universities after a break, or maybe you've never been forced to adhere to that convention, is this notion of referencing and APA. So first of all, referencing is not just APA. I'd like to stress that. In educational settings, we get a bit narrow-minded, and so we have, sort of corridor mentality that we say it's just APA. There's lots of referencing styles. So that's the important thing to first acknowledge, is that yes, in academic writing, we insist on the referencing style. Why? There's no logic to it. First of all, yes, a convention of formatting, of appearance, that we all sort of format things in the same way. But mostly there's really a very user-friendly sort of reason for it, logic for it. You're reading through, you get a concept, you understand where it comes from, and if you're the reader, you're able to then go down to bibliography and actually go back to the source and explore this further if you want. So that's a very sort of research process. You are citing the origin of your ideas, and you're allowing the reader a vehicle to go, a time-efficient vehicle to go back down to the reference and then find the source themselves if they're interested in exploring further. And that's really the essence of this notion of referencing. So it's this sort of this copyright notion, right? Of, hey, I'm telling you where these ideas come from because they're not mine. And then the second idea of, I'm being your friend as a reader, and I'm directing you directly to where you can find more information on what I've just discussed. So that's the basic mechanism of referencing. There's lots of different styles. There's just a matter of convention. Why convention? So that everyone can agree on something. But obviously, different fields have different conventions. So in education, we tend to use APA, although that's weird in itself because APA, as you know, is the American Psychologists Association. We're not psychologists. So why, as education, as a field of education, we've chosen that one? There's a great debate around it. But anyway, for the moment, that's what we've chosen. Be aware that there's others. And even if you work in Europe, for example, they tend to use Chicago and Boston more. If you are in other fields, they tend to use completely different reference styles. So it shouldn't throw you that, yes, conventions are there to standardize and make things universal, but only universal within one discipline. And we haven't certainly come to an agreement across disciplines as to what reference style that should be, which makes it difficult for you because sometimes you're going to read, if you work in interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, you're going to work with journal articles that are not referenced at all in APA style, but they still obviously respect the conventions of their field. So this said, in education, we work in APA. So how are you going to try and stick to an APA format? So what I'd like you to do in the last thread is try and, there's an APA guide, and it's just been published, re-edited. It's the 7th guide. But I always find it really troubling when my colleagues say, I'm asking my students to read the APA style. I've never read anything as boring as the APA manual. I've opened it twice in my life, and I'm never going to look at it again. And I'm an associate professor. Just to tell you that there's a hypocrisy here. You don't need to read the APA manual to be able to do APA style. We've all learned on terrain We've all learned from reading other people's articles. We've all learned from very useful online resources. So what I'm going to encourage you to do as we finish today is to do that and to carry on this task, leave that forum open for the rest of the week. I would like you to hunt around for the best APA resources that you find and you'd like to share with your friends. There's a ton of 3-4 minute videos. There's a ton of one-page websites that are great and are going to carry all of the information that you require, right? Obviously, there's information that we're looking for is we're looking at how to do APA in the text, so how to reference an article in the text. So I'd like you to find something that concisely tells you how you cite the article directly in the text. And then there's the bibliography element. So how do you cite sources in the bibliography? And in the bibliography, you should probably be able to find examples that actually give you enough details to talk about the where you cite a journal article, the way you cite a newspaper article or magazine article, the way you cite a blog, right? Because these are three things, as we've just seen, that you're very likely to cite. So try and find enough resources to be able to tackle these three things. In your bibliography, how do you cite journal article, press and magazine, and a video? Let's say a YouTube video, okay? Place that in that running thread, and then hopefully we'll build a collective toolbox there of know-how. And again, that will avoid you having to ever dip into the APA manual, which really is a torture that you can avoid. Some great sources there. As you're posting these, be conscious of time, timeline. As I've said, the 6th edition has just been re-edited into a 7th edition. The APA Association, as the American Psychologists Association, has made slight changes. If you can highlight those changes as you post, it would be helpful for your peers. They're not major, they're very small. See if you can even find sources that tell you how APA has changed, because that's going to be helpful for you as you are navigating that change. There's also a lot of videos and a lot of one-pager that have been created around the tiny changes that have been created with the 7th edition of APA. It's not rocket science. It shouldn't be daunting. It should be really hands-on. That's why I like this idea of doing a collective thread where we're posting useful resources. It's a technique. Don't ever get a headache over it. It's not the essence of your work. It's purely a technique. You should have a very pragmatic approach to that technique, and you should use the resources available to help you with that technique. Okay? So I'll ask you to all share those resources on that collective thread that we've created, and we'll carry on. If you don't have time this afternoon, it's not a problem, but try and post during the week so that we have a nice little toolbox there of resources that are helpful. That's it for the afternoon. So you should be finishing early, and you should have lots of time to start thinking about your research question presentation for tomorrow, particularly the framing of it. As you've seen, it's the framing that is touchy. And then you might want to contact your team to start working on your team assignment for Thursday as well. Okay. So again, for Thursday, don't stress too much. 30 minutes collective group presentation. We're not looking for a thesis here. We're looking for really the basics on that methodology. Try and make it interactive. Try and make sure that the audience sort of is engaged and get something out of it. So the main objective, okay, and finding the key features of that methodology is not going to be super hard. There's a lot of things online. And then maybe just spend a little time finding 1 or 2 examples where you show us that that methodology has been used and how it's been used. Don't read the whole article, but probably the abstracts are going to be able to give you a good idea of what's been done and how it's been done. So I leave you for the afternoon. I will see you at 4:30. Have a good afternoon. And I'm going to post my reactions to the vignettes so that you can watch this in self-standing video when you have time, and not to keep you more than an hour, 9 a day. Okay, bye, and have a good afternoon.